And from Edinburgh, tonight's big question: should the victim of a crime help decide the punishment of the criminal? Believe it or not, this Saturday sees the start of the new football season, and with it, the launch of the government's Soccer Task Force, which, among other things, is trying to kick racism out of the sport and encourage more black supporters to attend matches. But as Julie Hall reports, without a change in the law, their attempts could be futile.
Ray Mohammed describes himself as mixed-race Asian. He's a London primary school teacher from Sheffield originally and remains a passionate Sheffield United fan. Ray believes racism at football games has been increasing over the last couple of years. An incident at a match last season made him question whether he wanted to continue going to games at all.
Well, last season I went to see Sheffield United play Southend, and during the match one of the black players got injured, and a small but loud group of Sheffield United supporters were making monkey chants and throwing lots of racial abuse at this particular player. It really upset me. I went to see a steward and they didn't want to know, and a police officer just shrugged his shoulders. I asked him if he could do something about it, and he just said no.
The incident prompted Ray to write to Flashing Blade, Sheffield United's fanzine.
While a Southend player was receiving medical attention behind the goal, where Blades fans were sitting, a small, very vocal crowd repeatedly chanted, "You black bastard, you black bastard." I thought we were living in the multicultural rainbow 90s and not the bigoted days of the 70s and 80s. Sadly, on that night at Southend, the small but vociferous racist louts were the winners. Why? Because the majority stayed silent. That's actually kick-started in other fans writing to the Flashing Blade and talking about the kind of racism that they've heard and seen, and that they really cheesed off with it, really.
We've come to a pre-season Millwall-Charlton friendly. Say Millwall and most people think trouble. But today it's here that they're using the law to tackle racism head-on.
Well, in 1994 we had a playoff second leg game against Derby County. The result of that match would have meant that whoever won it would go through to Wembley and possibility of Premier League. The intimidation was such that night towards all the players, but in particular the two black players that Derby had, was such that I felt something has got to be done about this. They were substituted that night by their manager, I suspect to protect them, and I felt that something had to be done.
Following that night, the club, police and anti-racist fans joined forces. They started identifying and recording the individuals shouting racist abuse. Confidently, the police took the evidence to the Crown Prosecution Service, only to be disappointed. The CPS said individuals chanting wasn't grounds for a conviction. There had to be two or more chanting together. The police watched this man shouting the most racist abuse for game after game after game, but there was nothing they could do because he was shouting alone. The police and clubs say the law is letting them down.
The fact is that most racial abuse is done by individuals towards either of the members of the crowd, towards players, towards the referee, which makes it very difficult for police, stewards or any other agency to do anything about it. And we had a number of arrests which we took before the courts, and the Crown Prosecution Service withdrew them because they said the evidence was not there, despite the fact that there was foul mouth and racial abuse towards players and towards other members of the crowd.
The Football Offences Act 1991 states it is an offence to take part at a designated football match in chanting of an indecent or racialist nature. For this purpose, chanting means the repeated uttering of any words or sounds in concert with one or more others. Because of the law, the police here at Millwall had to follow one of the most offensive and persistent abusers for 14 games before they caught him with two others joining in. At last they could make an arrest. The man's been convicted, fined £130 and is now banned from attending all football matches for 5 years. The police know a change in the law would enable them to arrest more offenders right now.
What we want is the Labour Party, as they did in their manifesto before the election, to change Section 3 so that an individual not two or more people, that an individual can be arrested, charged and prosecuted for the offence of obscene or racist chanting.
I mean, Ray, from your experience at matches, if the government changed the law so that individuals could be prosecuted, do you think that would make a difference?
Well, I would like to think so, because a lot of my Asian friends would not come nowhere near a football ground because they fear for their lives sometimes, and the racial abuse they constantly get.
The statistics bear Ray out. Whilst 25% of professional footballers are black, less than 1% of spectators are from the ethnic minorities. Black people feel unwelcome at football grounds.
The population around here is 27% black and ethnic background. That's certainly not reflected on the terraces at Millwall. And so common sense says that if we're going to get the right people into this stadium, they've got to be able to come here and not feel that they're going to get abused. And if they are, that something's going to be done about it.
This week, the government announced that David Mellor will head the Football Task Force, which is committed to eliminating racism in football and encouraging more ethnic minorities to play and watch the game. But when UK Law asked when the government would be fulfilling its pre-election pledge to change the law on racialist chanting, no date was forthcoming. It means police and clubs committed to convicting those chanting racist abuse will have to continue their painstaking surveillance work. At Millwall, they're disappointed, but won't give up.
Unless we actually do address this issue, it's never going to get any better. I would stress it is a small number of people who are actually ruining the pleasure of a lot of other people and deterring decent people from coming to watch their football club play football. If there were changes to the law, it would certainly make our job a lot easier. We would be arresting a lot more people initially, but I think we would get the message across, and I think we can actually alter the culture of football matches.
Before we came to Millwall, Ray had no idea they were taking a lead or that there was a law fans could use. Despite the difficulties, he's encouraged.
Ray, last season you were beginning to doubt whether you continue going to football matches. Has anything you've seen here today made any difference?
Well, the things I've seen at Millwall have been very, very positive. I think what the law needs to do, and information needs to be passed down to the fans, passed down to the clubs, so we know that we can do something about it, we can challenge racism, and hopefully we can eradicate it from football.
So you'll be following Sheffield United this season?
Certainly.
If you want more information about kicking racism out of football, you can write to Kick It Out, 111J, the Business Design Centre, 52 Upper Street, London N1 0QH.
You wake up one morning and there's a knock at the door. Someone standing there asks to come into your house. They seem very official, but should you let them in, or can you refuse? Well, obviously it depends who it is. Some people do have a right to come in, even without a warrant. But then again, there are others who you might think have a right, who actually don't. So who can come in? Well, imagine your house was on fire, or there was a gas leak, or it was infested with rats. Clearly, it's in everyone's interest that such emergencies are dealt with, and that's why certain people can come into your home, whether you like it or not. Not surprisingly, the police have wide-ranging powers. They can come into your home to search it if they're looking for drugs, porn, illegal immigrants, and firearms. And they can also come in order to make an arrest, to prevent death or injury or serious damage to property. And it's against the law to obstruct them. One of the strongest rights of entry is given to the fire brigade. They can force entry into your home even if it's your neighbour's house that's on fire. And if a member of the fire brigade is involved in fighting a fire, again, it's an offence to obstruct them. One of the most common visits to your house may be those from the gas or electricity companies. They can enter your home with a warrant to inspect a meter or disconnect a supply, and without a warrant if the official believes there's danger to life or property. And again, it's an offence to obstruct them. A tax inspector can enter only if they have a warrant because they suspect serious tax fraud. A VAT inspector may enter your home at any reasonable time without a warrant for any purpose to do with VAT, like inspecting goods that are liable to tax. If they get a warrant, then they can even enter your home by force if necessary to seize documents and search people. There are others too who can demand to come into your home. Planning and housing officials, for instance, although in most cases they must give you 24 hours notice and turn up at what the law defines as a reasonable hour. So, who can you turn away? Well, landlords, TV licence investigators and RSPCA officials, for example, don't have any right to enter, not without police backup anyway. Bailiffs also don't have as strong powers as you might think. In general, they can enter your home, but only in the case of eviction orders can they force entry. So, bizarrely, you can stop the bailiff if you keep all your doors and windows locked. If you want to know more about your rights to keep your home your castle, I'll be giving you an address to write to at the end of the programme. Last year, more than 350 children were charged with prostitution, the youngest just 12 years old. No one knows the true number of kids selling sex on our streets, but what the statistics do prove is that our attempts to prevent it don't work. But one woman from Yorkshire, whose own daughter was caught up in prostitution and then murdered by a client, is convinced that there is a solution.
Irene Iverson's 14-year-old daughter was groomed for prostitution by an older man over a 3-year period. Her desperate mother was unable to get any help from the law.
It was a nightmare waiting to happen. We lived 3 years. My whole family life was devastated, by what actually happened. Not just the final outcome, the 3 years of trying to pull Fiona out of this world that she had entered into.
Far removed from the secure family environment she came from, Fiona had been drawn into drugs and prostitution.
She had met this, well, I suppose we call him a boyfriend, if you like, when she was 14, and he was 26. And at first she seemed to be having a really good time, but although I was very concerned about her.
Irene called in the police and social services and told them her daughter was having underage sex. But they were unable to take action without evidence from Fiona. 3 years later, Irene's fears about her daughter's relationship with her so-called boyfriend were realised.
I found out about the prostitution the next day when the police came round, and we sat, and I wanted to know how Fiona had died, and I was going to identify her, and they had to tell me that she had been seen in the red light area in Doncaster. Well, I hadn't known. If I ever had spoken to Fiona about prostitution, she said, "No, Mum, I'd never do that. I couldn't do it," and I hadn't believed that she could. So it was a revelation to me, and I thought, but then of course I thought, well, of course of course this was what they all said would happen, and it had.
Fiona was murdered by a client who admitted the offence within a week, but her boyfriend, her pimp, was never charged with any crime. Since Fiona's death, Irene has been campaigning for action against pimps to stop other children like her daughter being lured into prostitution.
I started again to look more and more into these situations, and every time it was the same sort of situation. A pimp had introduced a youngster, an underage child, into prostitution, and no charges ever brought against them.
Why isn't it easier to prosecute pimps?
They're more remote from the scene. They're often very canny individuals, and the main offence that is often charged against them is living off immoral earnings, and it's necessary to carry out sustained observations to get the evidence. So it's not easy to nail the people who are exploiting the children.
Also, it's difficult to get prostitutes to give evidence against their pimps. Quite simply, they're scared.
He told me, he'd look after me, and for 2 weeks he did.
Fiona Broadfoot was forced onto the streets by a pimp when she was only 15 years old.
And then he took me to London, told me we were going away for the weekend, and gave me a packet of condoms and told me to earn him some money. At first I thought I was in love with him, but wasn't long before I realised it was fear, that sort of totally and utterly controlled by him. I wasn't frightened of standing on a street corner and getting in a car with 4 blokes and going off, doing business, or roaming around the streets till 6 o'clock in the morning. That wasn't scary. What was scary was going home without any money for my pimp.
Irene believes that more effective legal action against pimps and an enlightened attitude by police and social services towards children involved in prostitution is the way forward.
I think the police have mainly targeted the children themselves, which is very unfortunate. Although I think some police forces are changing their policy now and prosecuting those involved and those who are exploiting the children.
In Nottingham, they're tackling the problem in 3 ways: putting more resources into prosecuting pimps, targeting the punters who are deliberately seeking out children, treating them as paedophiles, and by considering the children themselves, not as criminals, but as victims. UK Law took Irene to meet the Nottingham Vice Squad to see how effective the scheme is.
Under our new scheme, what we do is we'd immediately take the child home and speak to parents or guardian and let them know exact situation as to how that child has come into our contact. We would then refer her immediately to social services, who would then do some background checks for us, and would initiate a planning meeting. It gives them an opportunity to take stock of their life and think about what they're actually doing and the kind of situations that they might find themselves in.
The demand for young prostitutes in Nottingham's red light district has dropped. Now punters know they're being targeted.
If they think they're just going to be dealt with for curb call, and if the child that's with them is of an age under 16, well, we're certainly looking for other offences, and it may be that they may get a label that they're classed as a paedophile. They're putting themselves on a sticky wicket, really, if they're going to come out on the beat looking for children.
But Irene continues her campaign to change the way the law is used so other families don't lose their children to the street.
I mean, it was, of course, you know, an experience that I don't expect to get over, and that I've had to learn to live with. The devastation and the grief is total and utter. If young people could actually look at her life and at the trap she fell into, and if the police could actually target the real criminals in the piece, then I think that would be my wish, that, you know, Fiona had not died completely for nothing.
If you're concerned that someone you know is involved in prostitution, you can contact a working women's outreach group or the Children's Society, which works with children in prostitution. This week's fact sheet has the details of how to contact these organisations.
Scotland is the only country in the UK which is still considering whether victims of a crime should have a role to influence the sentence given to an offender. Margaret Watson feels that as the mother of a murder victim, she and her family were completely excluded from the process of getting justice for her daughter. Margaret was thrown into contact with the courts after her 16-year-old daughter Diane was killed by a jealous schoolmate who mistakenly thought that Diane had stolen her boyfriend.
Diane was murdered in the playground of Whitehill Secondary School by another pupil, Barbara Glover. She was stabbed to death because Barbara Glover's boyfriend had told her he was going out with Diane to get rid of her. This all came out at the trial, and Diane's dead and she doesn't know why.
Diane's murderer was caught and convicted, but Margaret believes that the murderer was treated with more consideration than the victim's family.
The question is this: should the victim of a crime have a say in what happens to the criminal? Or is the impartiality and detachment of a judge vital in ensuring justice?
We brought Margaret together with 3 professionals who are not convinced about her views on how to give victims a voice in the courtroom.
Alistair, as a lawyer, do you think that a judge in a murder case like Margaret's should take account of the fact that the wider family are completely devastated by what's happened?
It's very difficult to lay down a general rule case by case. The problem is that you mustn't achieve a situation where some murders are somehow or other less worthy of punishment than other murders. That would be ridiculous.
Not because the victim wasn't loved as much.
If we imagine a prostitute murdered, no immediate family, no one to care for her, perhaps no one to mourn for her, does the person responsible for that deserve somehow or other to be punished less than for the premeditated murder of a good person with a loving and caring family who are upset at the person's death?
We as the victims have no rights at all in this country. We should be ashamed in this country the way we treat our victims.
The victims' needs must be addressed, but we believe victims' needs are best and most effectively addressed outside the courtroom. Our criminal justice system is based on an adversarial system. Therefore, there is the accused, there is the state. The victim becomes merely a witness in the courtroom.
Why shouldn't Margaret, whose life has been devastated by this crime, have an opportunity of making that absolutely clear to the judge so that he can include that part of the crime in the sentence?
There are certain victims who will very vociferously, very effectively put across the way they felt, the way they were affected by the crime. There are other victims who cannot do that, who will not be able to do that. Therefore, the justice in our system disappears, consistency in sentencing disappears, and justice is not meted out.
Scotland is the only country in the UK where someone charged with a minor offence can avoid a court appearance by agreeing to meet the victim of their crime.
How our scheme works is that it allows the victim's voice to be heard and to have some influence on how the accused can make amends for the incident.
Okay.
And I think that's really, and it allows the accused to take on board the impact of their behaviour, so both sides get benefit from the mediation.
You're only dealing at the moment with quite minor cases. Margaret, I believe...
That's a wonderful idea.
But you'd like to see it for murder, wouldn't you?
Crime taking place, and if it prevents the young people from going on to commit serious crime, we're all for that.
You're in favour, are you not, of victims and criminals actually coming face to face? Why do you want to see the person who killed your daughter?
Because you want to understand why. You don't hear it in court. The court is not about getting to the truth. Trial is not about that. The trial to me is about scoring points and getting one over the other QC, which doesn't help the victim and doesn't help the accused. We want to get to the truth of the matter. And the only way you can do that is to sit down in a room and speak to the person face to face.
Margaret doesn't believe that her daughter's murderer feels remorse or understands the emotional devastation her crime has left behind. She wants to explain this to the murderer face to face.
What do you think about the idea of a murderer being told they have to come face to face with the victims, of the family of the victim of their crime?
Well, I think that the mediation process works very much on the basis of it being voluntary and both parties willing to participate in it. That is why mediation works.
But if the victim's family want to take part, should we give a hoot what the criminal feels about this?
If you're doing it in relation to the mediation process, you would have to take both parties' views into account, whether they were both willing to participate, as the mediation process wouldn't work.
Well, but Margaret's point is, if I'm right in thinking, is that you're not worried about the murderer, are you?
No, certainly not. You want to understand why. That question is always with you. Why? Why my daughter? Why? What brought this girl to do it? See, we didn't realise to the trial what it was all about. But the point is, we applied for that, and we were told through Strathclyde Social Services that they're not even prepared to speak to the murderer on this matter because it might upset her, and they can't have her upset.
Margaret is not going to have any reasonable dialogue with the murderer in her child's case unless the girl is prepared to talk.
No, she should have no rights. The civil liberties in this country are always shouting out about prisoners' rights. I wish they would stand up, and I've approached them on many occasions and asked them, could you not please, and for once, stand up and speak for the victims' rights?
So what do you think about giving the victim a greater say in the sentencing of offenders? And should offenders be made to confront their crimes? Let us know. For any details of the items covered in this week's programme, we've produced a free fact sheet. For a copy, please write to UK Law 3, P.O. Box 55, London W12 8UE, or you can ring the Channel 5 order line on 0990 55 50 55. And if you think you have a problem with a law that we might be interested in for a future programme, call the UK Law hotline on 0891 700 151.